The sun was slipping behind the mountains, its last light spilling across the Wyoming plains in a soft golden haze. Caleb Hartman stood in the open doorway of his barn, a worn leather glove hanging loosely from one hand, watching as the wind picked up and rattled the loose tin on the far side of the shed. The smell of hay mixed with wood smoke drifted on the cold air, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote called, its cry fading into the coming night. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the familiar stiffness there. The day had been long, fixing the south fence line, clearing the pasture of rocks, and checking on a pregnant cow that seemed restless. This was how most of his days ended. His boots heavy with dust, his muscles sore but satisfied from work, and the ranch around him settling into the quiet rhythms he'd come to rely on. Inside the barn, the horses shifted, their hooves clinking softly against the boards. Caleb moved down the aisle, patting the flank of his gelding, Jasper, before sliding the heavy door closed. He liked this time of day, when the light dimmed and the chores were done, when the world seemed to exhale and leave him in peace. Peace had been his companion for a long time now, longer than he cared to count. It had been almost 10 years since the accident that took his parents and his fiancée in the same cruel season. After that, he'd stopped thinking of the ranch as a home and started thinking of it as a duty, something to keep him busy, to keep his mind from wandering where it shouldn't. Friends from town had tried to draw him out in the beginning. Barbecues, church socials, even blind dates arranged by well-meaning neighbors. But he'd found reasons to decline. Every time. People meant attachment, and attachment meant loss. He'd had his fill of that. The wind shifted, carrying the bite of winter with it, and Caleb glanced up at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering in the west, thick and heavy, the kind that promised rain turning to sleet before the night was over. He pulled his coat tighter around him and started toward the house, boots crunching on the gravel path. By the time he reached the porch, the air had gone sharp and cold. He lit the lantern hanging by the door, its warm glow spilling over the worn boards and the rocking chair that hadn't been used in years. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and old coffee. He hung his coat by the door, struck a match to the wood in the stove, and listened to the fire catch, crackling to life. He was halfway through slicing bread for supper when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, faint at first, just over the hiss of the kettle, but growing louder. The low, uneven rumble of an engine. Caleb set down the knife and went to the window. Out past the gate, headlights cut through the gathering gloom, swaying as the vehicle bumped over the rutted road. It was late for visitors. Too late. He narrowed his eyes, watching as the lights drew closer until the shape of a station wagon came into view, its paint dulled and streaked with mud. One of the headlights was dim, the other flickering. The car rolled to a stop in the yard, engine coughing before it died altogether. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was bundled in a thin coat, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid that had come half undone. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the way her shoulders hunched against the cold. The back doors opened, and 2 more women climbed out, one cradling a baby against her chest, the other ushering 2 small children toward the porch. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, clothes rumpled from travel. The wind tugged at their coats, and the baby let out a soft, fretful cry. Caleb opened the door but didn't step out. "Evenin'," he called, his voice carrying across the space between them. The first woman looked up sharply, as if startled. "I'm sorry," she began, her breath coming out in clouds. "Our car broke down a few miles back. We got it this far, but—" She trailed off, glancing toward the children. "We didn't know where else to go." Caleb's gaze shifted from her to the others. The woman with the baby looked exhausted, her cheeks flushed from the cold, while the third woman kept one hand on the boy's shoulder and the other gripping a battered duffel bag. They didn't look like trouble, but trouble didn't always look the part. He stayed quiet for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't make a habit of inviting strangers into his home. Not anymore. But the wind had picked up, carrying a chill that made him tighten his grip on the doorframe. The children's cheeks were pink, their noses red from the cold. "Come inside," he said finally, stepping back. "Fire's going." Relief washed over the first woman's face, and she herded the others toward the porch. The boy stumbled on the steps, and Caleb reached out instinctively, steadying him before he could fall. Inside, the women stood just past the threshold, stamping snow from their shoes. Caleb took their coats, hanging them near the stove where the heat would reach them. The baby whimpered again, and the woman holding her began to sway gently, whispering something soft. "I'm Caleb," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "There's stew on the stove. You can sit and warm up." They followed, the children clinging to their mothers. Caleb ladled the stew into bowls, setting them on the table with thick slices of bread. The women murmured thanks, their voices low, almost wary, and for a while the only sounds were the clink of spoons and the crackle of the fire. When the bowls were empty and the color had returned to their faces, Caleb showed them to the spare rooms. The bedding was simple but clean, quilts folded neatly at the foot of each bed. He stood in the hallway afterward, listening to the muffled sounds of settling in, soft laughter from one room, the creak of floorboards from another. It had been years since his house held more than his own footsteps. Later, lying in bed, Caleb stared at the ceiling, the fire's warmth fading to a comfortable chill. He could still hear them faintly, their voices carrying through the walls. Strangers, women with children, stories he didn't know. And he wondered, not for the first time tonight, if he'd made a mistake opening his door. Caleb woke to the pale wash of morning light seeping through the curtains. The house was warmer than usual, and for a moment he couldn't figure why. Then he heard it. Soft voices, the muffled clink of dishes, the faint creak of the old floorboards. He pulled on his shirt and stepped into the hallway, his boots in hand. The scent of coffee drifted toward him, mingled with something sweeter. Bread baking, maybe, or cinnamon. It was strange. For years, mornings had begun with the dry smell of kindling smoke and the bitter bite of coffee alone. Now there was life in the air. In the kitchen, Sarah stood at the stove, stirring something in a cast-iron skillet. Her braid was tidier today, but there were still loose strands curling at her temples. She turned when she heard him, offering a tentative smile. "Morning," she said, voice quiet but steady. Caleb nodded. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep much," she admitted. "Thought I'd make breakfast as a thank you. Hope you don't mind." At the table, the two children from last night sat side by side, buttering slices of bread and sneaking glances at him. The boy's hair stuck up in all directions. The girl had a missing front tooth and a grin that flashed when she caught his eye. Emily appeared from the pantry with a jar of honey, her baby balanced against one hip. She looked more rested than she had the night before, but her eyes still held the deep shadows of someone who carried too much alone. Grace came in last, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her dark hair pulled into a messy knot. She paused when she saw Caleb, as if uncertain whether to speak, then gave him a quick, almost shy nod. He set his boots down by the door and crossed to the stove. "Smells good," he said, glancing at the skillet. Sarah hesitated, as though gauging whether he meant it. "Just eggs and potatoes. We didn't want to waste what you had." He shook his head. "You're fine. Eat while it's hot." They gathered at the table, and for the first few minutes conversation was sparse, the clink of forks filling the space. Caleb wasn't used to talking over meals. He noticed the way Emily fed her baby in small, careful motions, the way Grace kept glancing toward the window as if checking for something, and the way Sarah's hand rested lightly on her son's back, even when she was eating. It was Grace who broke the silence. "Your land goes on forever, doesn't it?" she asked, looking toward the frost-covered fields beyond the porch. "About 800 acres, Caleb said. "Been in my family for 3 generations." "That's a lot," she murmured, almost to herself. Emily's gaze met his. "You live out here alone?" He nodded once. "Always have." Sarah's fork stilled over her plate. "That must get quiet." "Quiet suits me," he said, and left it at that. After breakfast, the women insisted on clearing the table and washing the dishes. Caleb tried to wave them off, but they worked together with an ease that made him step back and let them be. The children trailed after him as he went to check the woodpile, peppering him with questions about the horses, the barn, the strange bird calls in the trees. "You can ride a horse, can't you?" the boy asked, his voice tinged with awe. "Been ridin' since I could walk," Caleb said. The girl's eyes widened. "Can we ride one?" "Maybe another day," he said. "Horses need to know you before they'll trust you." Back inside, Emily was standing by the back door, watching the snowfall. "Does it get bad out here in winter?" she asked. "Sometimes. Roads close, drifts get high. Best to be prepared." She nodded, shifting the baby to her other hip. "Guess we're lucky the storm didn't catch us before we made it here." "Luck's one way to put it," he said, not unkindly. The rest of the morning passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Grace helped him carry in wood, laughing when her boots slipped on the ice. Sarah found an old sewing kit and mended a tear in one of the blankets. Emily stayed near the stove, humming softly to the baby. But there were moments, small, almost invisible, when something flickered behind their eyes. A tension, a wariness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was just past noon when Caleb found Sarah out on the porch, staring down the road. Her arms were wrapped tight around herself, though the cold didn't seem to be what made her shiver. "Expecting someone?" he asked. She startled, glancing at him quickly before looking away. "No, just making sure." He studied her for a moment, but didn't press. He knew the look of someone scanning for a threat. He'd worn it himself once, when grief had made the world feel dangerous. By evening, the snow had thickened, muting the land in a blanket of white. Caleb lit the lanterns and stoked the fire higher. The house felt different with them in it, warmer, but also restless. He caught himself watching them more than he should, noting the way they moved, the way they spoke in low tones when they thought he wasn't listening. After supper, the children dozed on the rug by the stove, curled up like kittens. Grace sat cross-legged with a mug of tea, Sarah read aloud from a worn picture book, and Emily rocked the baby in the chair that had sat empty for years. It was a scene that tugged at something in him, something he thought he'd buried under years of hard work and silence. He turned away before the feeling could take root. When he finally went to bed, the wind had died, leaving the house wrapped in stillness. But the sound of their voices lingered in his mind, threading through the quiet, like a song he hadn't heard in a long time. And for the second night in a row, Caleb found himself staring at the ceiling, wondering what he'd let in. Snow fell in lazy spirals outside the kitchen window, blanketing the fields until they seemed to stretch into forever. The sky was a muted silver, heavy with more to come. Caleb sat at the table with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the steady curtain of flakes drift past. The stove crackled behind him, the fire's heat reaching into the corners of the room. The ranch had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the emptiness he was used to. Somewhere down the hall, Sarah's low voice murmured to her children, coaxing them into sweaters and boots. Emily's soft humming carried from the sitting room, the tune rising and falling in time with the baby's contented sighs. And outside, he caught the sound of Grace laughing at something, a bright, unguarded laugh that cut through the winter stillness like a bird call. He had to admit, the noise didn't bother him as much as he'd expected. When they all gathered in the kitchen, the table was crowded with mismatched mugs, plates of toast, and bowls of oatmeal sweetened with the last of the honey. The children chattered between bites, their voices tumbling over each other in excitement about the snow. Caleb listened in silence, glancing at the women from time to time. Sarah seemed more at ease this morning, her eyes softer, though there was still a watchfulness in the way she scanned the room. Emily sat with her shoulders relaxed, cradling her baby, while Grace had her elbows on the table, already asking questions about the ranch. "So how do you keep all this running in weather like this?" she asked, gesturing toward the window. Caleb shrugged. "Same as in summer. Just colder, more layers, more firewood." Grace smirked. "Figures." She reached for another piece of toast. "I want to help. I can do something." "You can stay inside where it's warm," he said, taking a sip of coffee. Her eyebrows rose. "Not a chance. I came all this way. Might as well learn something." It wasn't worth arguing. He had the feeling she'd find her way outside, whether he told her to or not. After breakfast, the day unfolded in quiet industry. Sarah kept to the kitchen, baking bread and tending a pot of stew for later. Emily mended a stack of old towels, humming to the baby as she worked. Grace followed Caleb out to the barn, her boots crunching in the snow as she trailed behind him, the cold bit hard, seeping through layers of flannel and wool. Caleb showed her how to check the water troughs to make sure they weren't frozen over, then led her to the shed to fetch more hay. Grace wrestled with the pitchfork, muttering under her breath when it didn't move the way she wanted it to. "You'll get the hang of it," he said, a hint of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You mean if I survive?" She shot back, her cheeks flushed from the effort in the cold. By midday, the snow had deepened and the wind picked up, swirling powder into their faces. Caleb decided they'd done enough for one day and headed back toward the house. Grace fell into step beside him, silent now, her breath puffing in white clouds. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them instantly. The smell of bread was thick in the air, mingling with the savory scent of simmering stew. Sarah glanced up from the stove, her eyes flicking to Grace's reddened cheeks. "Guess you didn't take his advice," she said, shaking her head. Grace grinned. Worth it. They ate lunch together, the room bright with firelight, and the sound of spoons scraping against bowls. The storm outside raged harder, the wind whistling against the windows, but in here it was steady and warm. The afternoon slipped into evening. Caleb spent it repairing a loose hinge on the back door, listening to the quiet rhythm of domestic life unfolding around him. The women talked softly in the kitchen, the children played near the fire, and for a while it felt like the ranch had always been this way. Full, alive, steady, with the heartbeat of many lives moving together. But just before dusk, something shifted. Caleb noticed Sarah standing near the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill. She was staring out into the distance, her brow furrowed. When he came closer, she straightened quickly, forcing a small smile. "Just watching the snow," she said, but there was a tightness in her voice. He didn't press, though the unease in her posture stayed with him for the rest of the night. After supper, they sat together in the lamplight. Grace read aloud from an old magazine she'd found in the cabinet, her voice animated enough to make the children laugh. Emily rocked the baby, her head bent close to whisper something only he could hear. Sarah kept her hands busy with knitting, but every so often her gaze drifted toward the window again. When the children were finally tucked into bed, the house grew quiet except for the pop and crackle of the fire. Caleb lingered in the doorway of the sitting room, watching the women gather the last of the cups and dishes. Sarah caught his eye, offering a faint nod before turning away. Later, alone in his room, Caleb lay awake, listening to the storm batter the house. He thought of the day, the laughter in the barn, the warmth of the kitchen, the way Sarah's shoulders had stiffened when she thought no one was looking. The wind howled through the eaves, but underneath it all, he could still hear the faint echo of voices from down the hall, and for reasons he couldn't quite name, it made the dark feel less empty than it had in years. The storm passed in the night, leaving the world washed in sharp, white stillness. When Caleb stepped outside the next morning, the air cut like glass in his lungs. The snow stretched unbroken across the pasture, the early sun turning its surface to silver. His boots crunched with each step as he headed toward the barn, breath rising in slow clouds. The quiet was almost perfect, almost. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked open. Sarah's voice, low but urgent, carried across the frozen air. "Stay inside," she was saying to someone. Caleb turned, catching sight of her on the porch, wrapped in her coat. Her eyes flicked down the road, then to him, then back again. He followed her gaze and saw it, a single set of tire tracks cutting through the snow, fresh enough to gleam wet in the morning light. They trailed down from the county road toward his gate, then stopped just short of it. Whoever it was hadn't come all the way in. "You expecting anyone?" he asked, walking back toward her. Her jaw tightened. No, the word was too quick, too sharp, and it told him more than she probably meant it to. "Could be someone turning around," he said, But even as he said it, the idea didn't sit right. Out here, people didn't drive miles off the highway for no reason. Sarah glanced toward the door, where her son's face had appeared, pressed to the glass. She gave him a small, reassuring nod, and he disappeared again. Caleb saw her hand tremble as she adjusted her scarf. Inside, the women moved through the kitchen with forced calm, the clink of dishes and the scrape of chairs a little too careful, a little too deliberate. Grace tried to ask about the day's work, but Sarah's answers were short, distracted. Emily kept glancing toward the front window, her brows drawn together. By noon, the tracks were covered, but the tension in the air wasn't. Caleb went about his work with one ear tuned to the house, his mind turning over possibilities. He didn't know much about these women's pasts, but he knew enough to recognize when someone was running from something. And whatever it was, it hadn't given up chasing them. The afternoon passed in fits and starts. Grace came out to help in the barn again, but her usual chatter was muted. Sarah stayed inside, busying herself with chores that didn't need doing. Emily rocked the baby more than the baby needed rocking, her gaze distant. It was just after sunset when it happened. Caleb was in the mudroom, shaking snow from his coat, when the crunch of tires sounded on the frozen drive. Not the slow roll of a neighbor's truck, but something faster, heavier. He stepped out onto the porch. A dark pickup came into view, its headlights glaring against the snow. It didn't slow until it reached the yard, and when it did, the engine growled low, like an animal sizing up prey. The driver's door swung open, and a man climbed out. Broad-shouldered, heavy-set, wearing a stained jacket and a look that was all sharp edges. His eyes swept the porch, the windows, then landed on Caleb. "I'm looking for Sarah Miller," he said, his voice rough with a practiced authority. Caleb's stance didn't change. "Who's asking?" The man's mouth twisted. "Her husband." Behind Caleb, the door opened a crack. "Caleb!" Sarah's voice broke off when she saw the man. Color drained from her face. "Get back inside," Caleb said without looking at her. His tone left no room for argument. The man took a step forward, boots grinding in the snow. "She's my wife!" "And those kids are mine. You got no right keeping them here." "They're not yours anymore," Caleb said evenly. "You got no say in that." His voice rose, sharp enough to carry into the house. "Sarah, you come out here right now." Sarah's hand gripped the edge of the door, knuckles white. The children's faces appeared behind her, eyes wide. Caleb moved down the steps, closing the distance until he stood between the man and the porch. "You need to leave." The man's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're messing with, rancher." "I know enough," Caleb said. "Last warning." The air was tight, the cold biting at exposed skin. The man shifted his weight, and Caleb's hands curled into fists inside his gloves. A door slammed somewhere behind them, and a new voice cut through the standoff. "That'll be enough." Sheriff Tom Rivers strode up the drive, his breath steaming, his badge catching the porch light. His gaze flicked from Caleb to the stranger, then back again. "We got a call about a disturbance." Grace stood in the doorway now, a phone clutched in her hand. Tom stepped between them, his voice low but firm. "You need to turn around and head out, sir. There's a restraining order on file." The man's expression twisted, a mix of rage and something meaner, but he backed toward his truck. "This isn't over," he spat, climbing in and gunning the engine. The truck roared down the drive, taillights shrinking into the dark. Caleb stood there a moment longer, the cold cutting through the heat of adrenaline in his veins. When he finally turned, Sarah was still on the porch, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, but it was a brittle thing. "I thought he wouldn't find us." "He won't get another chance," Caleb said. "Not while you're here." The sheriff promised to file a report and keep patrols near the road for the next few days. When he left, the yard felt emptier, but the air inside the house was still tight with fear. Later, after the children were settled and the lamps turned low, Caleb found Sarah in the kitchen, staring into her mug of tea. "I don't know why you're doing this," she said softly, not looking at him. "Because you needed somewhere safe," he said. Her eyes lifted to his, searching for something she didn't ask out loud. And for the first time since they'd arrived, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was a place where she could stop running. Morning came soft and pale, the light spilling across the snow in a gentle glow. The storm had broken for good, and the air was crisp but calm, the sky a wide stretch of pale blue. Caleb stood at the window, coffee warming his hands, watching the breath of the horses drift like smoke in the pasture. The house behind him was quiet, no hurried footsteps, no voices in the kitchen yet. It was a rare, still moment. The events of the night before still sat heavy in his chest. He'd slept little, his mind turning over every detail of the confrontation in the yard. The way Sarah's eyes had gone wide when she saw the man. The way the children had clung to the doorway. The way his own body had moved without hesitation, placing himself between them and danger. He didn't regret it, not for a second, but he knew things had changed. The danger wasn't an abstract shadow anymore. It had a face, a voice, a truck rumbling into his yard in the dark. A floorboard creaked softly behind him. Sarah stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of the heavy quilts from the spare room. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and there was a faint tiredness in her eyes, but her chin was lifted in that quiet, unshakable way he'd come to recognize. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Neither did you," he replied, and a small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth before it faded again. "Thank you," she said after a pause. "For last night, for everything." Caleb turned from the window, resting the mug on the table. "You don't have to thank me. You were in trouble. That's enough reason." "It's more than that," she said quietly. "We didn't know what we'd find when we came up that road. You didn't have to open your door to us. You didn't have to keep it open this long." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached for his coat. "Come with me," he said. Outside, the snow crunched underfoot as they crossed the yard. The air was clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the ridge beyond. He led her past the barn, up a narrow trail where the snow lay untouched. The path wound toward the far pasture, where the fence line met an old apple tree, its bare branches etched black against the winter sky. They stopped beneath it. Even stripped of leaves, the tree had a kind of quiet dignity, its roots deep in the frozen earth. Caleb leaned against the fence, his gaze on the horizon. "This tree's been here longer than the house," he said. "My parents planted it the year they got married. Said they wanted something that would outlast them. I didn't understand that when I was a kid. Now I do." Sarah's breath puffed white in the air. "Because it keeps standing, no matter what comes." He nodded. "Storms, drought, hard winters. It just stays, gives something back every year." He turned to her then, his voice steady but low. "That's what this place is for me. I thought it was easier to keep it empty, but I was wrong. It's better when it's alive." Her eyes softened, the wind catching loose strands of her hair. "You're saying you want us to stay." "I'm saying I don't want you to go." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant creak of ice on the fence and the soft whicker of a horse in the pasture. Sarah looked down, then back at him, and for the first time since she'd arrived, her smile reached her eyes. Back at the house, the day unfolded with a different kind of energy. Grace emerged from the kitchen with flour on her cheek, laughing at something Emily had said. Emily moved easily between tending the baby and stirring a pot on the stove, her voice light as she sang a lullaby under her breath. The children ran in and out, trailing snow across the floor, their shouts of joy making the rafters ring. Caleb moved among them without thinking, mending a broken hinge on the back door, carrying in wood for the stove, helping Grace wrestle a tray of bread into the oven. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself after all that had happened, but it fit in a way that surprised him. That evening, they gathered around the table for supper. The lamplight threw warm shadows across the walls, and the scent of fresh bread mingled with the rich steam of stew. Laughter spilled easily now, no longer edged with caution. Halfway through the meal, Sarah reached for his hand under the table. Her touch was light, but it grounded him more than anything else could have. He met her gaze across the table, and the look they shared said more than words could. After the dishes were cleared and the children tucked into bed, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. The stars were sharp and bright above the snow, the cold air biting but clean. Behind him, the sound of quiet voices and soft laughter drifted through the open door. He stood there for a long time, looking out over the land. It didn't feel empty anymore. The house behind him was full of warmth, of life, of people who belonged. When Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his, he didn't pull away. They stood in silence, watching their breath rise into the night, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest that had been missing for far too long. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking for what had been lost. He was looking at what he'd found. In the quiet heart of the Wyoming plains, a lonely rancher opened his door to strangers and found a family he never knew he was missing. Through storms, danger, and the slow mending of old wounds, they discovered that sometimes love isn't a lightning strike. It's a steady fire, built day by day in the place you least expect. If you enjoyed this heartwarming tale, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you don't miss the next story of courage, romance, and second chances beneath the wide open sky.